I tried to round up a couple more people while we're here. My name is Paul Karch. I'm a parent. I have a 32-year-old daughter, and kind of while I'm waiting for the other people to come in, I'll tell you one of our favorite stories in our family about naming, and that is we did not meet any other people with IDIC until our daughter was 12. So we were explaining to our 10-year-old daughter why we were going to this meeting in Chicago, and I said, oh, there's going to be other families there with kids like Rachel. And she hadn't really been paying any attention, and she looked up at me and she said, a whole room full of Rachels? Do you think that's a good idea? So a Rachel was kind of a definition at that point for something we didn't know. So I'm introducing a Rachel here, Rachel Callender. She's a TEDx presenter, speaker, trainer, award-winning artist, and the author of the Outstanding Book of the Year Award. For her book, The Super Baby Power Project, which I see some up here. This exceptional book celebrates the lives and abilities of children with chromosomal or genetic condition and was inspired by Rachel's late daughter, Evie, who was born with a very rare condition herself. So, Rachel, welcome and thank you.
And so I wanted to make a book to celebrate the lives and abilities of children in New Zealand, because I was still living in New Zealand at the time, and to share their stories and their superpowers. So I travelled all over New Zealand, and I met 75 incredible families with amazing children with a whole range of chromosomal and genetic conditions. And I discovered many superpowers, and I photographed them and wrote their stories, and it was such a powerful experience. So many of the families shared incredibly powerful perspectives, and consistent themes were emerging in the way the families were describing their children. The families were saying, our children are teaching us perseverance and kindness and empathy and unconditional love, and we're finding meaning and joy. It's incredibly hard, but we wouldn't have it any other way. This is what they were saying to me over and over again. But they were also saying that a lot of them were scared to take their children out into public because they were afraid of the looks, of the fear, because they had learned from day one that their child was a diagnosis, which of course isn't true. They believed that they weren't allowed to take their child out in public because their child wasn't reaching traditional milestones. They looked a little bit different, which I found heartbreaking. They were trying to find meaning and potential, and they were in themselves, but the way that we've constructed disability, or the way that we view disability, hasn't evolved enough to allow these parents the same freedoms that others do to share their children with the world. So it was a really interesting project. And this is where our worlds connect. Because if in case you're wondering, why is a wedding photographer talking to a whole lot of medical professionals? And what I've learned over the last few years in telling my story and sharing my perspectives and interviewing hundreds of families and health professionals is that there needs to be a common language, a bridge or an understanding, a shared humanity in this space. Because when a parent is feeling traumatized at a new diagnosis, language and words really matter to avoid adding to the pain and the confusion. And so this is what this workshop's about. It's about bridging some gaps, holding a space for each other so that the expertise of the health professionals can really land and connect with the parent so that they can grow and move forward in this new space, empowered as much as possible to take responsibility for what's happening with their child and to learn and grow. It's like learning, well, it is like learning a new language. It takes time and it takes collaboration and it takes a lot of patience. So this workshop is all about empowerment, not just for the parent, but also as health professionals, because we're also hearing from health professionals that there's a lot of frustration when patients don't understand what's being said, and so they're not listening or they're not taking on the advice that's been given, that they're not being able to use the knowledge and the expertise that you have. So I've developed a few tools that we're going to go through over the next little while, and they all lead to the same point, which is empowerment for both the parent and the professional. And as I talk, I love that some of you have got your phones out taking photos of the slides. Please feel free to do that. They're here for you. They are your resources to use and share. I also encourage collaboration, and there'll be a lot of question and answer time as well, because we can learn so much from each other in this space. So what we're looking at up here on the screen is what I'm calling the health language matrix, because I believe that the language of this space falls into one of these quadrants. And we have the two axes, the positive and negative, and then the jargon and informative. And in the positive jargon quadrant, we get language that comes from a very well-meaning place. It really does. It comes from a desire to connect, to be kind. But often it kind of lands somewhere else. It's sort of a bit fluffy. It doesn't connect. You get a lot of phrases like, special kids are only given to special parents, which is a nice-ish thing to say, but often parents, when they're first finding out or they're living this life, the parents are feeling isolated, traumatized, broken, despairing. They're in so much fear and uncertainty that they're not feeling special. They need a lot of support and a lot of help. So this kind of language makes them feel dismissed and unseen. And I'm wondering if we can potentially add some of these words. Like, can we think about some times when maybe you've been given a fluffy language, or you've heard some kind of language, and we can share it with the room so we can understand maybe more examples of this type of communication. Is anyone brave enough to collaborate? Yeah, of your own, in your own life. If you've either given some, there's no judgment. We won't make any judgments, because this is a space of learning and growing. So if you've received this kind of communication, or you've felt yourself giving it, or it's been given to you, yeah.
A common phrase that I've heard still here is, well, you're only given this challenge because you can take it. You know, sometimes God's involved, sometimes not, saying, you know, you can stand up for this. You're strong enough to take it. And my first reaction is, yeah, and you're just glad that you aren't, right? I mean, the person saying it sort of suggests, yeah, you're strong enough to take this burden. I'm glad it's not me, is implied. And also, it also seems to me kind of silly. I mean, that may be true, but that doesn't mean I want it. I mean, it doesn't mean it's good for Rachel. And so that's how I still probably, I don't know, many times a year anyway, someone will say that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. And we hear that a lot. It's a common one. You're only given what you can handle, and you're like, I don't want to handle it anymore. I'm done with handling. Yeah.
In the old days, they used to, give a lot of negative projections, and I feel like now doctors have overcompensated. And so one of the things that bothered me early on was when they said, she'll do as well as you advocate for, which really put a burden on me that any problems were my fault.
Wow. Yeah, that's really heavy. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Vanessa.
I love this, and I think it really is, wearing the clinician hat, I think that one of the challenges in this area is that we want to continue to instill hope for all of us, because there is, especially because in this area in particular of, kind of, especially in the neurodevelopmental space, we don't know a lot. We don't have a lot of answers. And so I think one of the struggles that I have, and I think probably many of us do, is, in that zone, not just fluffy, but there's a lot of vagueness and a lot of, we think this can work, we don't know, let's try. And I do sometimes worry that I'm coming across as just being too vague, right? Because I don't have concrete answers. I don't have a specific, set of guideposts or whatnot. But I want to make sure that I stay on the positive end, because I have hope. And, so for example, I've seen patients with 15Q diagnoses who have been told that behavioral intervention is not going to work to improve cognition or functioning or anything because it's a genetic cause. And that's a lie, right? Now, having said that, have we done proper clinical trials to say that behavioral intervention will work? Well, no, but I've seen it clinically, and I think many of us. So of course we're going to push for that, right? But when I have that conversation with parents, it falls, I think, in that quadrant of like positive, fluffy, maybe a little jargony, because I don't, it's not informative per se.
Yeah.
But so I guess anyway, just it's kind of long-winded, but I think it's a quadrant that I think many of us sit in a lot, and we don't want to, but it's better to be up there than down in the negative.
Yeah. Thank you, Shefali. I think you've made a point that will come to naturally, that this space actually, the language comes often from a space of fear, you don't know, and you're trying your best and you're giving hope, but you're kind of in the dark as well. So you're trying to put a band-aid on an incredibly deep, open wound. Nathan.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly. If you see me taking notes up here, I'm just kind of paraphrasing what you're saying, because we're learning all the time wherever we go, and it's really powerful. But I also am really curious, how many people in this room are actually parents? I'm seeing some hands. And then clinicians, scientists?
It's cool.
Both?
Nice.
Wow, okay. Thank you. I just needed to see where we're coming from.
Thank you, Nate. Very cool. That's nice, actually, that we can see that. That's good. I should have done that at the start. That's good. Awesome. Alrighty. Well, what we might do, we'll move into the next quadrant because we've got a lot in this one as well. Thank you so much for contributing. So down here we have the jargon negative, and this is confusing language. It has a negative outcome. It's jargony. It's just confusing. So like I was just briefly telling you in my story with Evie, talking about words I'd never heard before, I didn't even know how you spell it. And I remember I was emailing my family with all of the updates of Evie, just couldn't understand what was going on, and I'd spelled it wrong. There was no anchor point of what was happening. And at one point we had a pediatrician, and he'd come in to explain the nature of chromosomes and what, explaining my balanced translocation and Evie's unbalanced translocation, and he used a library book metaphor, and I don't know if anyone's heard that to describe translocations, but basically he said, Rachel, your body's fine because it's like a library, all the books are there, but some of the chapters from Game of Thrones have ended up over there in Pride and Prejudice, but your brain can unscramble it because the words are there. And I was like, okay, all right. And then Evie's got too much Game of Thrones, not enough Pride and Prejudice. And he was talking about the long and the short arm. And at this point, we'd been in hospital for 2 weeks. And there's test after test after test. We'd been given one diagnosis, and then now we're being given another diagnosis. We're sleep deprived. And he comes in, and I knew he was a really important person. So I kind of had to brace myself and go, he's a very important man. He's only got a few minutes. Your one job, Rachel, is just to understand everything he says. And so he started talking about the chromosomes and how they split, and my brain was all confused with the books. And then he started talking about the long and the short arm of the chromosomes, and all I could understand was short arm. So my brain got hijacked at that point on short arm. And so I thought he was saying that Evie had short arms. And I was like, to me, they look perfectly, beautifully longish, And I'm like, on top of everything else, he kept going on about these arms, and I'm thinking, I know people that can live with no arms. Why is he going on about the arms? And so I wasn't hearing anything he was saying because I was stuck in that moment, because that's what I understood. And so anyway, he finished off his spiel and asked me, have I got any questions, which in a way that made me feel like I should not have any more questions, but I was brave enough to ask him. I was 25, completely exhausted, small. I had a small I felt small and scared, and I what are you going to do about Evie's short arms? And he was just like, well, nothing, they're fine, and then walked out the door. But in that moment, I felt stupid, like such a dummy, on top of everything else, all of the other feelings, trauma, completely violated with all of this information, absolutely distraught, and then feeling stupid on top of that was just unbearable. And so I internalized all of these icky emotions and mentally threw them back at him, and basically was just like, I hate this man. I hate this doctor. which is awful for this man because he had such important and powerful knowledge and expertise. But every time he came near me to explain anything, I just mentally shut down to protect myself from feeling all of those horrible feelings. And so he'd say things, and I'd be nodding and smiling, yes, I understand, oh, good, Didn't hear a word of it, but I didn't feel stupid. And this is what happens in this space because you're so confused. You feel small as a parent and you don't ask questions because you're afraid of being silly. It's not a safe space when you're confused as a parent. But there's so much expertise being wasted because this is where a lot of language in the health system just falls. Like when we were first given Evie's diagnosis, we were told that she had multiple ventricular septal defects. And I'm just like, what? But I might have been able to understand heart holes. Like the language wasn't translated for me. I eventually learned this new language and I could relay it back, but it took time. So I'm wondering, as health professionals, are there phrases or words or things that you're commonly using that is just so common to your tongue that may not be being picked up by your parents? Maybe we can spend a little bit of time talking about this quadrant. And Vanessa's ready with the microphone. And again, there's no judgment. This is a place of learning.
I'd love to hear from the parents in the room,
Yeah.
some of the crazy stuff you hear the first time,
Yeah.
and then what makes you close down. Because we hear, oftentimes in our group, the jargon is one of the biggest and most talked about questions that
Yeah.
comes up over and over and over again. And we try to explain it in different ways with different language, but we can't seem to crack this. So please give some examples, because I think this is a great workshop because we have professionals in the room, we have parents,
Yeah.
but giving specific examples is going to be super helpful. So,
Yeah.
So, it's kind of funny. Back then, was not funny, but
Yeah.
I got the diagnosis when she already was 14.
Yeah.
And the doctor said to me, okay, she has duplication 15, but I know nothing about it, thank you, goodbye.
Oh, that was it.
Yes, and then I thought, that's all. And I thought, no, I have 2 pages for you, you can read about it. And then, goodbye.
Yeah.
And it's all. And you're the first one, the only one.
Yeah.
Your child is the only one.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
it.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's really intense. And I think often those pieces of paper that you're given aren't really for parents anyway. I'm wondering how many words did you understand on those pieces of paper? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we had a similar experience at the beginning where the genetic counsellor looked at the report and said, well, we don't really know very much about this. I will credit them. They didn't give us too much in the way of platitudes of, or anything to do with God. But, but I think it's going to differ for different people. Different parents want different things, but I think ultimately all of them want to hear the truth. They want some information about what situation they're in and their child is in. So it is kind of frustrating to hear that you don't know. Sometimes that's the answer.
Yeah.
I completely agree that the jargon should be. Talking in Latin to parents is not a good play.
Yeah.
The good news is that's a correctable thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you so much.
The word I remember being confused by is hypsarrhythmia, which is one that we probably hear a lot. And I remember our neurologist, who really worked very hard at trying to talk to us, said, well, you can see from this that she has hypsarrhythmia. And that was meaningless to me because I didn't know what it was supposed to look like. So a gee, the brain waves as measured should be kind of in sync, and look, they're all over the place. That I would have understood instead of just saying over and over again, hypsarrhythmia. That was meaningless.
Yeah, great perspective, thank you. Oh, look at all the hands going up. This is lovely. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, my daughter was at 1 year old, brought into a major hospital because she was one of the first 215s that was diagnosed. She's 30 now. And the neurologist was known as a wonderful diagnostician. But he called me at 11 o'clock at night because she had high ammonia in her blood, and he wanted to do more tests. And he said, oh, yeah, and they found another chromosome, but the geneticist will call you about that, as if it was nothing. That was sort of one of my heart.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Something that I found confusing for my daughter is when we got the result of the EEG for seizure, and the result were, it is not normal, but it is not abnormal, which was quite confusing, and I still don't know what to think about it, because it's not normal, but it's not abnormal. Doesn't tell me if she has a seizure or if something is wrong. And so the doctor uses technical words that I didn't even understand, like in French it will be pic occipital. I don't know what it means, and I find it difficult for me to understand the result of all the EEG that we have.
Yeah.
Not normal, but not abnormal.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good one for that quadrant.
I am a neurologist, and so I know very well what you say. Actually, maybe the wording that they used was confusing to you, but if we take a look at the results of an EEG, we have three categories. One is normal, one is abnormal, and there is a gray area in between that unfortunately does not help in making a correct diagnosis. Unfortunately, EEG has a lot of defects and limitations. Then in this gray area, you may have different interpretations between those who read the EEG. Because maybe that if somebody says, well, I'm uncertain, but it might be normal. There are others that say, I'm uncertain also, but it may be abnormal. And this is something that we face every day, because if you give an EEG to a number of persons like the ones that are present in this room, you may have 50 different interpretations. Because, you know, the EEG is a dynamic examination. There are a lot of artifacts that come out, and this is what you were mentioning. So at the end of the day, it may be difficult, unless you have very clear tracings, that you put that as normal or normal.
So that was beautiful.
This is a great example of that.
Great example.
Most doctors don't take the time
No.
to do that.
No.
They say it's not abnormal, but it's not abnormal, and then they shut the door and walk
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I.
Thank you.
Thanks, and again, as a neurologist, I agree with this, but the biggest question here is not explaining the actual EEG. I think the question is how much time do you have to take, how you can make it understandable to both sides. I think parents and the neurologist about expectations from one side, right? It's knowing, you have to communicate the information, but also it's got to be in a way that the family, my experience is in my clinic that the family will keep only 10% in the first visit. So, and then we're talking about an extremely technical issue like the EEG that takes here from an expert 5 to 10 minutes. So you realize where the confusion is going to be in the end. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure even if the EEG is important on the first day or not. But bottom line is, I think the discussion needs to focus on how you communicate this rather than going into the technicalities of EEG and all that stuff. It's important to understand the EEG, but more important thing for me as a physician on the other side is, okay, what do we do now? What do you understand? What's your worst fear about what's coming? And how can I help you navigate through that? I think the first visit is probably better from my experience than going into all the finite details that will come later anyways. But I may have it wrong. So.
That's a really good perspective, and one that you've jumped all the way straight into the positive informative quadrant with your greatness there. Thank you. We'll touch on what you've just mentioned a little bit.
Anyone else? Anybody else?
Thank you. This is great. I love that we can feed back to each other. This is really, really powerful. Thank you so much. All right, we'll come over here to the negative informative quadrant. Now, this is a really important one because this language is actually destructive. I believe this takes human potential and spirit away from a person. This is words like incompatible with life, where do you go from there? You know, often even if a child is born without air in their lungs, often they've been a dream, a hope, deeply wanted, and then to be labelled incompatible with life is really confronting. And for me it was confusing because Evie was alive, she was in the world. It's words like retarded, which is still being used today, and it is one of the most horrific, degrading terms we can use for another human. Yeah. Abnormal. I know it's a medical term, but it's subtractive for a human. You know, if a person is labelled this enough in their life, they start to believe that that's who they are. They believe that this is an identity, that they are abnormal, defective, dysmorphic, mutation. You know, this is the language of the rare disease space with chromosomes, and it's really challenging. And I wonder how you guys feel about this space. And language is constantly evolving, you know. When I first made the book and I showed my Nana, you know, she's 93, she was like, oh, look at all the beautiful Mongoloid children. I said, no, Nana, this is why I'm making the book, you know. But she didn't know any better. That was her reality. And so it's about gently educating the world that language evolves and we need to keep up. We need to keep humanity and value and meaning at the centre of our interactions.
So you mentioned that your Nana said that, and I think it's also important to be understanding of both sides of the spectrum there, in that, you know, the cultural, it's easy to say this being on one side of the cultural divide, if you will. And I think that it's harder, you have to be respectful, I think, as well of older individuals, for instance, where some of those terms were part of the normal lexicon of that time, and maybe in their training and such, to not be as sensitive to the newer cultural changes, right? And it's easier when you're on the more sensitive side than it is if you're on the not so sensitive side. To say. And the other thing I wanted to, I'm curious about too, is like having been a patient in some context. You know, I'm a scientist, and I can understand the technical jargon, and I, you know, can take it in, and I should be quick to digest it. But I find that when you're the patient, or maybe the parent of a patient, the first words you hear are such bombshells that they're overly destructive one way or the other. And it also makes it hard to synthesize everything else you've heard, and so that contributes to the confusing nature of it as well. And so part of it's the context in which you are, rather than the words themselves being confusing, in addition to the words themselves being confusing and perhaps destructive, but like the context you're very charged, and I found it hard as a patient to take words in and know what to think about them. And what I sort of wished in my experience was that somebody delivered the bombshell, sent me off, and said, "You're going to come back and see me in a couple days. Come with questions and think about it and Google it or don't Google it, whatever advice they have, or here's our resource person that you can reach out to," right? That you just kind of need that moment to get yourself out of the initial bombshell of it to then come back and be able to think about it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Great perspective. Oh, Vanessa, we've got one down the front. Oh, hands everywhere.
Yeah, so just kind of along those same lines, I'm an epilepsy specialist, and I see almost like the vast majority of kids I see are either autistic or have a neurogenetic syndrome, so I have a little bit of a unique perspective because I have a daughter who has autism, and so it's when you're first starting, you do residency, you start practicing, and you kind of think you get it. You see enough kids and enough families, and you hear their stories, and you say, okay, I get what it's like for this. But then you actually have a kid, and you realize that you don't get it, and that's when you do realize. That's when you do get it. Is when you go through it yourself, and it's interesting because a lot of I'm open about it, so I tell people, and they say, oh, it must be easy as a doctor to raise these kids, and it's not. It's not any easier. And in some ways, it's not even easier to give the news, knowing, like, having been through it and having sat there, know what was helpful, what wasn't helpful. It's still not always the easiest thing to kind of get it out. And one of the things that I try to pass on, and I don't know if people have the same experiences, but when parents of young children, it's you get the news and it's all about the negatives. It's like, okay, this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem. And my daughter's 14 now, so I'm kind of in that phase now where it's like focusing on the good things. It's like, oh, look what she did, look what she kind of your perspective changes over time, and it's hard to kind of grasp that when the diagnosis first comes. But I try to tell people it's like, it's going to get easier. I mean, not easier, but like, it really does kind of, as time goes by, your perspective changes and you start focusing on more of the positives. But it's hard to relay that at the beginning and say, oh, just trust me, in 10 years you'll be in a much better place. But it does happen. But I try to relay that, but it's not an easy thing to do, even having kind of gone through that journey too.
Thank you so much. It's a great perspective. Yeah.
Well, two observations. One is early on, our neurologist said, because I said, well, what is a seizure like, and what's her head like? And he said, well, it's kind of like there's an electrical storm going on in there. And I found that fine. I go, oh, okay, I get it. If you brought my wife in right now, she would say that was terrible. You should have never said it. I mean, so different, it's different people like different kinds of things. And I've, in fact, I think my personality is I'd rather just have it straight as you can make it and not worry. And in fact, when she was diagnosed, and this is a long time ago now, so some of this is more fable than reality, but a bunch of different people called us, and some people said, oh, she'll be all right. That was my father-in-law. He never really did figure it out. But one of my friends, I told him what it was, he goes, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. And that was very affirming for me. It was terrible. I mean, it wasn't all going to be terrible, but the first news, it's terrible. And so now a lot of people don't like that. So it's challenging, I'm sure, in your thinking about this. People react differently.
No, it's good. This is a huge part of why communication is so difficult. Yeah, because we need so many different forms. Yeah, no, it's a great perspective. Thank you. We'll do one more at the back and then we'll move on. Thank you.
I think about this a lot, language in this particular quadrant. I'm a clinical psychologist and a researcher, and I work with kids with autism and neurogenetic conditions. And I work particularly with kids who have limited language, the minimally verbal, nonverbal group. And I find it really difficult to balance accurate, informative language with language that isn't going to be difficult for parents to hear. I'd be happy to hear people's perspective on it. There are no nice words to talk about intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is better than terms we used to have for it, but it's still never going to sound nice. But I think at the same time, it's a disservice to families if we aren't upfront about where their child is at developmentally and what skills we want to be working on. And I really struggle to figure out the best way to balance being truthful and informative and accurate with also, you know, sensitive to the parents' feelings and what they're going through at that time.
Yeah, great point, thank you. Well, on that, should we move into the next quadrant, because that's where we're kind of heading, into the positive informative quadrant. So this is where we're trying to get to, where we can make as much of our language and our communication land and connect. And this language is empowering, it's connecting. It's like a magnet, you know, when there's two magnets and they stick together. Imagine that as a parent and a health professional, that when they're communicating, that's what's happening, rather than when you get the opposing magnets and you're trying so hard but you never can stick. We need the communication to stick. And there's been a few people that have kind of touched on this kind of communication. And I'll give you a few examples of this kind of communication and how it was given to me and how it changed my perspectives, and then maybe we can kind of start throwing out some that you may have experienced if you're parents or attempted if you're health professionals, communication that worked. So the first piece of empowering communication I received was from our clinical geneticist. So we'd been triggered obviously with my own balanced translocation, and after the paediatrician tried to explain it and didn't quite land, we were sent down to genetics. And the first thing that this man said to me after he gave me a big smile and welcomed me into his office, he said, "Rachel, what do you know about chromosomes?" First thing he said, he established my health literacy. Took him a second. Where is our baseline is what he's trying to say. Where can we grow? So I said to him, look, honestly, I couldn't even draw you one. So he said, all right. So he's establishing, I'm a visual learner. I couldn't even draw you one. So he's like, right, let's draw a chromosome. So he's drawing away, explaining as he's going, and I'm just like, the short arm, I see it. Like, I get it. Magnet click moment. Genius, took him 30 seconds. So there was a comment earlier like, we've got so much to say, how do we make it fast and efficient? You've got to ask more questions. Because I think, especially with health professionals, you've got so much information to give. And I love the perspective, you know, it has to come in small bite-sized chunks, otherwise you get stuck on, you only hear 10% anyway, and the rest is just bamboozling. So this clinical geneticist, that was the moment for me. Like, he taught me so much about chromosomes in 30 seconds. I instantly trusted him because he didn't make me feel stupid. He was warm, he was friendly, he listened to me, he asked me a question. And then he was able to explain further, and he said to me, he said, as doctors, because of these chromosome conditions, there is so much that we don't know, and this is why. And that allowed me to let go of my unrealistic expectations on the whole health profession, because as a parent, I didn't understand why the doctors didn't know. I'm like, you're a doctor, you're supposed to know everything. You know, that's the expectation culturally that we have on our poor health professionals. It is the most unrealistic thing in the world for them to know everything about everything and to deliver it in a way that makes sense to us. But because he said we don't know everything, and here's why, I'm like, oh, wow, who would be a doctor? That's really hard work, you know? Like, I could empathize with him. And in that moment, we formed a partnership of equal mutual respect and understanding, which is, I think, it has to be a baseline when it comes to communication. How are we feeling about that as an idea? Yeah, let's talk about this for a little bit.
So I think we were really lucky because we were diagnosed on Monday. The conference in Philadelphia was Thursday in my town. So I came with my piece of paper. I had no idea The parade was overwhelming. My kid is interstitial. I didn't even know the difference. But Carolyn Shannon, who characterized this syndrome, gave me her card and said, call me in a few weeks, I'll get you in. So we had that period of a few weeks to process and do some research. And she had the time of, she probably spent 3-4 hours with us because she's a researcher and she had time. And she drew out the chromosomes and explained everything. My husband's a PhD, works in biotechnology. He understood all the science. We talked about the state of the science, therapeutics, what was possible, what was likely. And there wasn't a lot to do. But what was really helpful to me is I said, we have a data point of 1, and you have an experience, you have multiple data points. So, my kid is 4. We have all these IEP goals that are pre-literacy. Like, do we go down an academic route, or do we work on adaptive skills? Like, what does this look like? And she was able to paint a picture for me. So now my kid is 12. Some of that is true, some of it wasn't true, but she gave me a point that I could look at. She said, he'll be able to read. She said, he'll make friends, but they'll be a few years younger than him. He might not be that great at math. And she said, when he talks, he'll speak poetically. Wow. So here he is at 12, and he can read at like 2nd grade level. He loves books. He finds a lot of enjoyment from them. He can read menus. It's really impacted his life because we have fought for it, and we said his flavor of autism, allows us to do this. He's actually really bad at math. And when he talks, his language disability has him pull words that are not really natural together. And so it is poetic, right? So, we have, hotel houses when we have VRBOs. And when he has a new babysitter named Casey, he's Casey Quesadilla, right? So he plays with words in ways that are unusual. But it was really helpful for me to have a vision of what that looks like. And she said, when puberty starts, watch out for anxiety, and at these points there could be seizures, but in interstitial they're manageable oftentimes. So she gave me this view of what could be and what we should work towards, and hope if we come across some bumps that we would be able to deal with that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah. Awesome.
I've got another question. The terms or words positive and negative can be confusing as well. Positive as to what, negative as to what. I think that is a little bit less, it's a little bit more abstract, I guess, compared to jargon and informative. Yeah. Because a lot of people can differentiate that.
We can develop the model here and now. We can change it up if we want. I think it's more the effect it has on a person if they can perceive their future as positive or negative, or how they see their child. It's more the impact that they are left with. But yeah, again, it fluctuates too.
I think an important aspect that's not shown here is and again, from the physician standpoint or the scientist standpoint, is the time appropriateness, whether it's, the time that you break, the time you spend in the first visit, or the time that's appropriate for a family to hear not everybody is on the same page, and the time for the physician to break some news if they don't have all the information or what it means down the road. And of course, respectful should be on that scale. It should always be respectful. Yeah. But if you don't appreciate the other factors, then it's going to be negative no matter what. I mean, but it can be confusing, I think, the positive and negative.
Just a couple of thoughts. So I think, I see a lot of families who have already received a diagnosis and then come to us for, as part of a specialty clinic. And it's really striking to me how many families have spent time with geneticists, have spent time with many clinicians, and don't understand the basics of their child's condition. And so I've taken the stance, I just assume we're all at step one. And I'm a terrible artist, but I also get out a pen and a paper and I draw. And for, with the Do15Q in particular, it is confusing, like what's IDIC, what's interstitial, what is a duplication. And so we just sit down together and I start from the basics no matter what. And if they already know it, I say, if this is already, something that's a review for you, sorry, we can go through it faster. But, and I would say 99% of the time, they're like, this is the first time someone has just explained to you what IDIC is. Yeah. And I think that's, that first diagnosis, I agree, there's so much information we're giving, and it is hard information to give no matter what, but I think we really need to start becoming more proficient, like consistently as a field in that first diagnostic sort of time point. Because the things that I've heard from families, I won't even say some of them, because they honestly bring me to tears, like some of the information families have been given about their child's prognosis, at a time when all we're giving is a genetic diagnosis. The other thing I would say is that one thing that I think is really important that I think a lot about in that quadrant is I really think it's important as care providers that we make our families our partners from the beginning. And so I think I love the word empowerment because, their parents are a part of this journey. And frankly, if they enter the journey with hope and with optimism, but with, as Charlotte is saying, which is very important, a realistic understanding of what their child's condition entails, then they're going to be a part of this, they'll be part of the journey every step of the way, which means behavioral interventions, accessing services, finding the right, all that, but it's a team, and it's so much better for everyone if we're a team, And so I think that again, the parent empowerment piece is so, so important. And it really, really is striking to me that in this day and age, the way conversations are happening at first diagnosis and the pieces we're having to pick up often are, and I'm sure Ron's shaking his head at the same thing. I mean, I'll give one example because to me it was horrifying, but it just tells you that people are still doing this. I had a family, Do15Q actually, they had a new IDIC diagnosis and they'd already seen a genetic counselor actually who, they came to me and the mom said, I'm really afraid that she will never gain any developmental skills and she'll never walk. Now granted, this child already was cruising, like she was holding on. I mean, unbelievable, at like 2.5, so it's really early for that, so, and I just finished giving her sort of a sense of where she was developmentally and that she was making great gains, and the mom said, well, I'm really surprised because for a year, we've assumed she'll never make gains, and I said, why do you think that? She said, well, the genetic counselor, this is what they said to me. He said, your child has developmental delay, but it's not delay like when your flight gets delayed and you eventually get on the flight. This is the kind of delay where you're never going to catch your flight. That is what this genetic counselor said to this family. I mean, can you imagine and I actually she broke down into tears, and I did too at that moment, because I thought to live with that for a year, that's what you've been, and that's the analogy in your mind that like, I'm never going to catch the flight. I mean, we need to be just changing the way we're having conversations with families, because that is not empowering at all, right? And in the meantime, this family did not seek out interventions for this child, because they thought, well, if we're never going to catch the flight, what's the point, right? Yeah. I mean, which is never the conversation. So anyway, I don't mean to share that to upset people, but this was recent, and it, it's happening still, so.
Yeah, it is happening still, and we're, Nathan and I are just making our second book in Western Australia, and we're talking to 33 families, and it's the same stuff, like interventions aren't being offered because your child there's no point. Yeah.
Just one comment on that. I mean, it seems horrible that this person said you're never going to catch the flight. There are cases, though, where the kids won't catch the flight. They won't learn to speak, no matter how long it'll take. I'm not saying that the advice they... Yeah, they're not in status. They will change over time. Yeah. I think so. I agree with you. As long as they don't try and sugar the truth. No.
What we know about this is based on the therapeutics and the interventions we have available right now and not available in the next 5 years. Yeah. And yet we're given a diagnosis for life, right? Yeah. And it's hard to reconcile this. And I think part of the discussion needs to focus on next steps part of the optimism, because there should be some optimism, right? Is definitely uncertain, but I think there are good things coming for kiddos with Duke 15Q. I think we can certainly say that if you go across the scientists, whether it's going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, I think in the next some years, we'll see some new therapeutics that will apply in Duke 15Q as well. Is that going to apply for every child? No. Is that going to apply for a child that you see in clinic tomorrow? I don't know. But that's where I think the optimism needs to stay there, because these statements are written on concrete. The parents are going to remember that. Yeah. And that's a hard statement for me to make as well in clinic, that, you know, this child is not going to meet milestones for one or the other. We don't know that.
Okay, I'm going to do Paul, then Ron, then Carlos. Okay.
I was just trying to think of positive things that we still use. I mean, I'm back to your start where, you know, you're pushing her down the street. And one is to say, Rachel never gives up. She has great perseverance. Sometimes as a parent, that seems like a bad thing, right? But there's posters about how wonderful perseverance is. So that's true. Another positive thing that we say about her in context is that everybody likes her. I mean, in school, it was actually a teacher who said this. Well, let's think of positive things about Rachel. There isn't a person in this building who doesn't adore Rachel. It's hard to know why sometimes, given what she does, but it's still true. So thinking, and then some more sort of physical things that we've used when she's been in the hospital, because if you think she's having seizures or something's happened and she's sort of unconscious in the hospital, the doctors looking at her don't know anything about her. So I tend to say things like, well, when we were swimming last week, to just get it in people's heads, this is not an inert body, she can swim. Or show pictures, I even showed it here today, of her on top of a bluff. Well, how did she get there? She hiked up there. I mean, to try and think of, you know, what can she do that, and not, those examples don't work for everybody, but they work for her.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. We've got lots of discussion. We can have a few more. This is the whole reason for the workshop.
I'll be quick. One of the nice things about having these specialty clinics, like the Duke 15 clinics, is that you can see a lot of, you know, you see a big number of people, and we've seen, I think, 135 now at Mass General. And so when you have young kids and they're asking what's going to happen, you can kind of give them a range. You can say, well, we've seen 130 people, and some never talk, some talk in sentences, and kind of everything in between. And you can at least kind of, you know, if things go really well, this will be here, if not here. And then, so I think it's really good to know kind of like Guy was saying, like the range of possibilities. You know, they may do better, may not do as well. And then I think sometimes it's helpful to try to say, but, you know, even if they don't, you know, if they don't talk, there's devices, even if you're at that kind of lower end of the spectrum, there's, you know, better seizure medicines, there's better communication devices, there's still hope to get better, but, you know, you may end up anywhere in that range.
I love that. And I think what you've touched on, Ronald, is that we are so obsessed as a culture with normal and everyone being the same, and it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower, and it's not the children's problem, you know. It's like with buildings, you know, if we build a building and the door isn't tall enough and a person who's taller than the door wants to walk through, is it a problem with the person or a problem with the door? Like, this is what we're coming up against here. So if children aren't speaking or they're delayed by, what measurement are we using? It's the measuring sticks that are wrong here, not the children. And so if anyone's going to be in the session tomorrow, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, I'm loving that you guys are coming up with this. Carlos.
Thank you, Rachel. So my name is Carlos. I'm the dad of a daughter of 2 years old, fourth Duke 15Q. So in roughly a time, so she was diagnosed at 1 year old roughly. So in 1 year, I experienced a lot of fluffy, confusing, and even destructive talks. Very few empowering, and I recognize how hard actually is the work of health professionals. What I learned of this workshop is that it's very important actually to build a trusted platform, a trusted partnership platform, and because we are talking a lot about perception actually. So different people coming from different backgrounds with different sensitivities. So I think that the first thing, as you mentioned, is to take time at the beginning in order to it could be very quickly, as you actually explained, but to build this trusted platform. And once you have this partnership relation, then you can go and then you can be very factual and say probably very difficult or even not very funny things. But you are already on a very trusted relationship. So it's very different. You will hear and you will learn a lot because if you don't have this trusted platform, you just don't connect. And I think the key word here is to connect with parents. It's, as you mentioned too, is let's say a teamwork, and it's very important at the beginning to take the time and to do that. Yeah. So that's just I'm very new here. I'm just learning a lot, and that's what probably just trying to wrapping up our workshop. So thank you very much for sharing, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Yeah. You say something? Yeah, thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly pay respect to what you acknowledged earlier about, these negative words are still often the truest, most informative words, and it's tricky to just call them negative. And from all of our experiences, hearing from, hundreds and hundreds of you guys, often the only difference is, in fact, do you have the next slide that makes all the pretty colours?
Yes.
Often the only difference in that line between negative and positive is the attitude shift, so not the expertise but the empathy, which is, you also mentioned it and you mentioned it, it's the knowing of the parent. And then you may still have the exact same words, and often parents will say, after the initial grief, we love this language because we now master it. Yeah. But in the beginning, it's only negative because we can't pair it with the empathy of the parent. So I'm just acknowledging that a lot of people feel the same, and so this shape that we're looking at here is the way we relate with that information, not necessarily even having to change some of the words.
Yeah. That's exactly right. That's a crucial piece, because what we do not want to happen is having a rule book of words that aren't allowed and words that are allowed, because it's never going to work. And I think maybe this is a perfect segue to just the next piece in the workshop. This has been so good. I feel like we could talk like this all day and it'll be so good. You've got something else to say. Thank you.
I think going back to just presuming competence, I think if you're going to err, you should err on the side of giving people a view of what is possible, right? So if you do interventions and you achieve the best case scenario, then great. But if you give somebody low expectations, you might not pursue those things. So my kid was, this year he was diagnosed with intellectual disability. And for somebody that has multiple postgraduate degrees, that's really heartbreaking for us. But, it's 8 years into the process. And so we know that he can do certain things like swim, and we know he has a really difficult time doing things like talking in sentences and paragraphs. So, over time, we've gotten closer to where his trajectory is, given where he is in terms of medical management, right? So I think if you're going to err, you should give a more positive view, because it's something to strive for. And then also give, risk factors, you should be aware of seizures, you should be aware of things that could come along, or GI issues or whatever. But presume competence, because even kids that are nonverbal can communicate.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing I do want to touch on is oftentimes we hear, you mentioned it, that you closed down after, and then you just basically didn't hear anything else anymore. We oftentimes hear couples hear things differently. The same couple is sitting in the same room hearing the same words. A Guy is a great example of this. Guy and his wife are very different people, and I'm sure if you told them, does anybody know Guy's wife? But I think that if you sat in a room with them and told them the same story, they would come away with very, very different summaries, especially if it's a factual story. And so I think that oftentimes the language that you're using as a clinician, depending upon which parent you're talking to, you might need to change it. You also mentioned that Anne's the same way. So the other thing I want to say is, like, you're talking to two very empowering physicians here. Actually, all the physicians here.
Yeah.
When we hear feedback and families want to go to so-and-so's clinic, it's because they establish that empathy, they establish that. Ron can say anything to most of his patients now because he's established the baseline.
Exactly.
And now he can really tell them anything.
Yeah.
He's like, now your kid has short arms.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. I want to share one more piece of empowering communication with you because it was in a very difficult medical situation, and I think that often we are in difficult medical situations and we don't know what to say. So at this particular situation, Evie had choked, vomited and choked and aspirated, which was a thing that happened constantly and sent us into hospital a lot. She'd been intubated and put in an induced coma and flown to a hospital at the top of New Zealand. And the concern was that when they extubated her, she wouldn't be able to breathe on her own. We were thrown, do not resuscitate forms were thrown at us, and the chief of surgery started talking about tracheostomies as a way to manage this potential issue if they extubated and she couldn't breathe. And the way that she handled this really difficult situation, Evie was only 4 months old, so she was tiny, and we'd been through a lot with her. But she sat us down, she made sure that we'd got some sleep. She said, make sure you're rested because we have some big stuff to talk about. Beautiful expectation setting, like we knew we were coming into a difficult conversation. She set that up beautifully for us. And then she explained everything. She said, look, these are the options. If we extubate, she may not make it. If we give her a tracheostomy, she will live, but this is what's going to happen. This is the quality of life. She explained the whole process, what was going to happen, what our life was going to look like. And so we had a really clear picture of the decision that we were making. She made it clear that no question was stupid because this was a major decision. But then she said something I'll never forget and what changed my view of health professionals. She said, just because we can do these things doesn't mean that we should. And that whatever you choose as a parent isn't wrong, and that you are doing the very best for her, whatever choice you make. Because parents, someone mentioned that there was guilt. There's guilt about, what if I don't advocate enough and that's the reason why my child doesn't succeed? There's that guilt that you carry, like, what if I haven't done enough? What if I'd done this? What if? And that can eat you up as a parent as well. But she placed our family's values on the table along with all of her expertise, her scalpel, her team. It was all safe and sacred and important. It was beautiful. And again, it didn't take long because she asked us questions. She just said, what do you care about? And what you care about, I will care about. It's like her ego. She had transcended that need to be the hero in the story, and she, in that moment, became an incredible ally and a mentor. And I'm going to use that just to segue. We're going to finish with a piece. Nate's going to come and present, and then we'll open up for questions again. I think this might be a cool way to finish. We've got about half an hour.
I would love to share with you guys a perspective from the storytelling world. Storytellers work with the principles of life, but they use metaphor and archetypes instead of literality. I guess we've just been watching an example. Rach stepped down onto this platform and immediately kind of wrote the metaphor that she is part of you guys and let's talk, as opposed to being on a podium and just lecturing. So storytellers work with metaphor all the time, and in this particular space, I want to just share with you one little piece called The Hero's Journey. And is anybody familiar with this? Just a raise of hands. Has anyone heard of Joseph Campbell and The Hero's Journey? There's 1, 2. Has anyone seen Star Wars? Just a raise of hands. There's a few more. Excellent. So Joseph Campbell has spent a lot of his life researching the hero's journey, this archetype of the hero over thousands of years. And he wrote a bit of a rule book on the journey of the hero around this circle. And he sat down with George Lucas, his friend at the time, and just said, hey, look at this. Here's this journey of the hero. And George Lucas said, yeah, I get it. I'm going to make a movie about that. I'm going to call it Star Wars. And so they did, and they were both successful in their pieces. And I just want to walk you through this, just to isolate a few characters that we can actually maybe apply in the way we relate to the parents of our kids, we relate to patients. So in the hero's journey, the hero begins in an ordinary world, and he's pretty regular, she's pretty regular, they're just a general person, and they get a call to adventure. Luke Skywalker cleans up a droid and gets this little message, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. He's got this haul. He refuses it, he's got work to do back on Tatooine or wherever he lives. And then he meets the mentor, that great Jedi, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And at that point in time, this mentor has the experience and the tools to actually help this hero. And this little line of crossing the threshold is something that writers call an inciting incident. Now, every parent in the world is kind of aware of what this is. It's when a writer needs the protagonist, needs the hero to move forward in a story, needs to write some conflict into their life, needs to somehow get this story going. And the writer puts an inciting incident in there, throws a bomb in the way, throws somebody to rescue, throws something that the hero just has to get into. So in Star Wars, Luke's parents die and he just is in a rage and he needs to go off. But we've all experienced this forcing of the hand, this pushing us into this story that we don't even want to be in, but we're in it regardless. And now we've got the next step. Now we've got to get some tests and some conflict and we meet some allies, we meet some bad guys. And so in Star Wars, of course, there's this approach to the great conflict. There's this Death Star thing. They battle, they go through conflict, they return. There's this journey back and then this resurrection of the final attack on the Death Star. Everyone still following me who's seen Star Wars here? And the last step of the hero is that all is saved. The hero returns victorious. They walk down the aisle and they get applauded, and voila, a great franchise is born and the hero's journey is complete. Now, this has been written for thousands of years. It's kind of the archetype of how a hero works. I'm about to change the slides, the last chance to take photos of this one. It's not my work, it's Joseph Campbell's. But I would like to walk you through really quickly 3 roles that we see in story and that we see in this hero's journey. There's the hero, the mentor, and the victim. And we're going to see something reflected in our lives in different parts of these. So the hero in a story is the lead character. They generally want something. They want something meaningful, and they're often small, afraid, or weak in the beginning. So it's interesting because we all, want to be heroes when we relate to patients. But the hero in a story is actually the weakest character. They're the ones who have to go through all the conflict. And they're ultimately transformed into something great, but it's the hero that does all the work. It's the hero that doesn't know the answers, doesn't know everything. They're fighting to learn, to advocate, to grow. They become the hero by the end of the story by doing all that work, by accepting help, by building a team of allies, by taking on all the conflict. So it's interesting that when we think, I want to be the hero, the hero doesn't swoop in and rescue. The hero is actually going through all this journey in story writing. So the mentor, on the other hand, is not the hero of the story. They're not the lead character. They don't do the work of growing and changing. What they have is the tools and the expertise to actually help the hero get where they need to go. It's a completely different role. The mentor exists to support and empower the hero. So it's interesting that a mentor already knows their value. They're not competing with the hero to win the prize. They're not even in the race. They've stepped out of the race and can now advise. They know their worth. They know their power. They've transcended the need for status, which is really interesting when we think of how we relate to patients, how we relate with our loved ones sometimes. In stories, 2 heroes meeting on a road, they can't both exist together. They just high-five and keep walking. You can't have two heroes. A hero doesn't need another hero in their story. They need a mentor, somebody who can support them on their journey, on their quest, anything like that. So obviously where I'm going with this is the relationship between us and our health provider, us and our children, or us and our patients can be many, many things. But to take on the role of mentor means that you can step back from the pressure of saving, rescuing and solving somebody else's problems, and instead know that you're here with great wisdom and great tools and talents, and you can pace yourself to help the hero be empowered and achieve. Now, I need to point out this third role. From a storytelling perspective, there is this role of a victim. Now, a victim in a story is not actually even a character. They're the collateral damage of someone else's story. They don't grow, they don't do anything. If they took on challenges and grew, then they become the hero. They're not the victim anymore, but a writer writes a victim as a pointer to point out who the good guy is, who's going to save me, and who the bad guy is, who's persecuting me. So when we think about this role of I feel like a victim, that's okay, it could be true, but you cannot stay in that role because that's not even a character. Writers don't use them for anything else outside of describing the other characters. So victims can be quick to blame, afraid to take responsibility, and you can read the rest of it. So I wanted to run this through very, very quickly because being in the role of mentor as a health professional is a mental and relational decision that helps you position yourself to actually take the best care of the heroes with your tools and your expertise. You're essentially the strongest character in a story, but you're positioning yourself to help and empower the parents or the partner or the other people in that. And that's a very, very fast version of the hero's journey. Ultimately, I guess we need to think about what story we're telling ourselves. Are we the hero? Are we battling and trying to win? Do we have a goal and something we really want? And that's important, that's good. But how we are relating to people, maybe we need to step into the mentor role. Maybe we need to step into the victim. The stories we tell ourselves end up being how we set our expectations. And so in this space, we have seen as the most powerful way for health professionals to really consider who they are and how they relate to parents. So I know that we don't have much time for this, so we can talk about this a little bit, if you like. Yeah. How does that sit with you? It was a very fast run through, but I'm interested to see whether you guys feel like you've seen some of this in action in your patients or in yourself. And then if you have a question specifically, then now's a really good time to chat about that. Often you might have parents who are victims or feel like a victim. And, if you are the hero and the parent is the victim, then you just get all the praise and the victim doesn't move. But if you step into the mentor role, then you can start encouraging them to be the hero of their own journey, and that's the empowerment that we're talking about. So I might just open it up if anyone has any perspectives on some of these slides that you've just seen. Very fast. Everyone wants to watch Star Wars again now. Yeah. So like I said, it's a metaphor and a way of thinking of how life can work. But I'll leave that with you guys for a second.
Thanks, Nath. I really love this piece and this tool that Nath developed. We've shown this to a number of health professionals all over the world in all different specialities, and we actually have a slide. We showed it when I first met Shafali, and the slide was to health professionals, and it just said, "You are not the hero," which kind of offended everyone. They're like, "What do you mean we're not the heroes?" And they had kind of had a bit of an identity crisis. I'm like, this is the issue, because it also releases health professionals from the expectation of being the hero. If they can identify themselves and saying, actually, we can step back, we can become the mentor, our expertise can be shared, go forth, these are the words, this is the language we use, this is potentially what's going to happen in your life. We're not the experts. You're going to become the expert on your child, and we're here to support you with all of the skills and the tools and the knowledge that we have. That's the kind of empowering communication that we need to be delivering to our parents. We don't have the answers. You're going to see things that no one else has seen things. Your child is going to do things that no other child is going to do. They may achieve whatever, they may not, but we're going to give them every opportunity to make sure that they reach their best potential, because we see your child as being valuable. That's what a parent needs to hear at the beginning and constantly on this journey, because they're constantly going to be going through conflict, and they've got every right to feel like a victim. But on the other side, we've heard health professionals saying, I feel like a victim because the system is setting me up to be the bad guy or the victim, because I can't thrive in this space because I've got so much to do and so many things to share, and I've got 10-minute appointments, and it's brutal. But what if we were actually able to be honest with each other? When a health professional meets a parent for the first time and says, look, I actually don't know what's going on, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that you get the help and support that you need. And therefore, it's not about making it up or trying to say the right thing. It's being honest. And that's a vulnerable space, but it's a really powerful space. When we can acknowledge fear and uncertainty with each other and figure out a way to work through it together, I think that's when the best partnerships are made, and that's when the best health outcomes happen and potential is reached. I don't know if that feels okay for you guys. Yeah? Awesome. I'm going to skip through a little bit. I've got 3 questions here on the board, and I call these empowering questions because they elicit a human response from somebody, connecting points. And I loved when people asked me these kind of questions with Evie. And right at the beginning, when you first receive a diagnosis, you don't really know the answers to these questions as a parent, but you learn as you go. And I think setting up that expectation that you will learn and you will grow, and to be told that although this might feel like the world has fallen out from under you, it's going to slowly regrow because you're going to be supported. But when a health professional or a community or friends or your partner can ask you these kind of questions, it gets you on the same page and alignment. So when someone asks me, what are you proud of your child, instead of what's wrong with her, I described my child as a human being, and they connected to that. And then we both grew and we learned from each other, and she became part of our community. When someone asked me, what do you hope for her future? What I wanted for Evie was for her to be independent and for her to continue the movement that made her the most happy, even though she was supposed to be standing and walking, which for her wasn't appropriate. It didn't work. So how could we make the way that she was the most independent and free safe for her? What do I hope for? How can we get on the same page here? How can we connect? And what are you afraid of? When I was able to share this with my health professionals, that was the most powerful thing for me in my story with Evie. Because I was constantly afraid that Evie was going to vomit and choke and aspirate and stop breathing, and I wasn't going to be there in time to catch it. And we were already, in the ambulance every other week, in the ICU, too many times to count. So when I said, look, I'm so scared, I'm hardly sleeping, because what if I don't hear it? They said, look, Rach, we'll empower you, we'll upskill you, we'll send you home with an oxygen machine and a sucker machine. So when this happens, you can suck all the goo out, shove some oxygen on, buy yourself a few minutes, and hopefully the ambulance gets there in time. And so they did that. And you know what? These 2 pieces of equipment kept us out of hospital 9 times out of 10. We were able to manage at home by ourselves. So them listening to my deepest, darkest fear reduced the cost of care because they listened to me. They asked me these questions. So I think communication is about trying to establish a connection point. Where can we connect? It's like that magnet again. Like, tell me what you know about chromosomes. Where is our baseline? Where can we begin on this incredibly challenging yet deeply meaningful journey that you as the parent, the hero, and your child are going to undertake with us, the health professional, as the support and the guide all the way through. We've got a few moments, and I think maybe we can just open it up for the room for questions and comments and perspectives just to finish for the last few moments. Does that feel okay? Yeah? Thank you, Vanessa.
Any comments, questions, thoughts? We should send Rachel back to Australia.
That's great, thank you. Just for presentation purposes, I would probably change the order of the questions.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, tell me.
And again, that's my perspective. I would start with the last one. What are you afraid of?
Yeah.
What do you hope for? And what are you proud of to finish off the...
I think especially in the beginning, at the start, that would work really well. Yeah.
And then going back to the hero story, which was great, I think there needs to be another bucket there. Because not everybody has to be the hero, and not everybody... When I see this, I'm trying to figure out, what if I don't want to be the hero? But I also don't want to be the victim, and I'm not ready to be a mentor.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure there to be the hero, I think. And there are circumstances, at least from what I remember of my clinic days, that there were some parents and physicians that nobody wanted to be the hero.
No, and the physician can't be the hero. They need to be the mentor,
Right.
which is...
But then
yeah.
somebody needs to assume that role, and then you end up in trouble because somebody is trying to be the hero, and nobody's made up to be a hero, and it's a horrible situation, I think, in the end. But it creates some expectations, I think, if you say hero, mentor, victim, especially in the beginning. You know, at the end, there will be a hero, but I think there's a process.
Definitely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, along that same kind of avenue, that one of the things I was kind of thinking where it was headed with the hero and the mentor and the victim, you know, and how they can be different roles. I thought that was great. But one of the things I was wondering if it was going to come up was, you know, if you have your hero and your mentor and it's not working out and they're not doing their roles, then, I mean, I think the victim actually becomes the child. Like, they don't get the care that they're supposed to. Yeah. And like, if, you know, either the parent isn't doing their part or the doctor isn't, or both, then that's really who ends up suffering at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And in that case, potentially you've got two heroes trying to meet each other and it's not working.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the hero slide?
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's go back to the hero slide.
Because I see what Demetrius is saying, but no, back, like to the hero. Yeah.
This one here? This one?
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that I agree with you at sort of the very sort of high level in terms of when you just think about the titles. But I think what you're trying to say here is that the hero is not like Superman, right? It's not the one who's going to like save the day and figure everything out. The hero is just the one who takes some like agency in their story. And I think that's actually a really, I'd never really thought of it that way. And I think that's a really nice way to empower families where, you know, yes, families often feel like victims, and we feel like victims sometimes because we don't have answers, and we have, you know, we're facing we become very good at, I always say this to my, you know, patients, well, we've gotten really good at diagnosing, we're great at diagnostics, right? And then we're sort of left with what next, you know? And so we feel a bit like the victim. Yeah. But to then sort of turn it into, you know, now I'm going to make meaning out of this and have, again, sort of agency in my journey, and that by definition is the hero. I mean, that's powerful, and I think it just changes the way we're defining hero. You know, hero is not, again, like Superman or Batman or whatever. It's
the hero is an ordinary person who has gone through conflict to find something that they need and find meaning in it.
Yeah, and I think this is the beauty of the heart attitude of hero versus mentor, that for years the health professional has felt that pressure to be the hero, to save everybody. And if they can read this right, then they can acknowledge that a mentor could sit on the sidelines for years if they needed to sit and wait, to be the village elder at the gate, to have the knowledge and wisdom and to be patient. And, you know, the pressure isn't to save the world. It is a lot more to wait for the right time to empower others to move forward in their journey. So I hope that you will read this as something of empowering, and it's more a heart attitude. And it is one piece of a larger story arc, which is the hero's journey, where the hero actually goes through hell and changes. But this is really more about a heart attitude and a perspective of how you relate to others.
Yeah. These are all tools to help with communication. Hopefully you're hearing that you don't have to have the exact right words, but if you can have a good attitude and the right mentality, you can step into a space free of those expectations to be completely safe with uncertainty and share what you know, even if it's not much. Yeah.
Back to your 3 questions. I know for me, my hope is that my daughter can live in the world without, the normal people can interact with her. Yeah. And my fear is that she'll be sort of in this very narrow, clinical sort of environment, so that if you know that some parents are like that, I put her life into years, and the first 5 years were the medical years, and then we had the educational years, and then we had the community years that now, she's in for a long time. But there's always that struggle as you get sucked back into the systems, so that, whatever the mentors can do to help us keep our kids in the world is really a powerful thing.
Yeah, that's a beautiful perspective, and I think that's what I love about these conferences is there's so much community here where there is love and meaning and joy and respect and an honouring of these children, these people with Duplication 15. And this is what I was trying to achieve with this book, is to break down those barriers, because parents just want their children to be seen and loved and cherished, I guess. Yeah.
One of the things I think about this part of it is that the hero doesn't do everything. I think it's easy as a parent to think, I'm the only person who knows what's going on. I have to do everything, and you can't. So the hero builds a team of allies, and I think a lot of this language stuff you've been talking about is important in thinking about how to build the team of allies. And we have a lot of personal caregivers, and how do you describe Rachel to them? And one of the things we've learned is we don't describe too much, because we want them to figure it out, and we may be wrong. I mean, that's the other thing that I usually say when I'm talking to new caregivers. We've been taking care of her for 32 years, and we're in a lot of ruts. You may be able to figure out something that works better than what we do, and so making that part of the language, I think, is important.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's interesting because these 3 character archetypes are quite fluid, because, we're talking about the parents being the heroes, but then eventually the child becomes the hero and the parent has to step back and become the mentor. And it's just this constant flowing identity that kind of adjusts and changes depending on the situation. So, yeah.